Welcome to Behind the Research, a podcast that will focus on the realities of stalking with first-hand accounts from victim survivors. I am your host, Karen Fullerton-Chalmers, and this series will focus on my doctoral research. Together, we'll explore the representation of stalking within film and television, as well as interviews with research participants to hear more about their stories and how these helped shape my findings. Caution is advised, as some content may be sensitive to listeners. Pseudonyms have also been used to protect participant identities. This episode was recorded a month before Rhianon's Stalker was released from prison in February 2024. Today on Behind the Research, we are joined by Rhianon, who, after her own stalking experience, is an advocate and campaigner for victims. Rhianon's story is one that showcases the escalation of behaviours when stalkers' actions are not taken seriously. Rhianon suffered various forms of abuse by her ex-partner, and when she finally ended the relationship, he continued this abuse until one evening, when Rhianon was leaving her car, her stalker appeared holding a shotgun to her chest. She was then taken hostage all night until she managed to escape the next morning. Her abuser was then sent to prison, but is due for release in February, despite the parole board declaring he is a danger to the public. Rhianon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Karen, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me to take part today.
Of course. So the last time we spoke would have been about 12 months ago, and your stalker was still in prison. But now, as I've mentioned, he's up for release in February, despite recommendations that he shouldn't be. So how does it make you feel at this time, knowing this?
It's, the whole thing is just extraordinary. It's just extraordinary. In some ways, what the parole board said in their letter that was published at the end of November, following the parole hearing, was really validating, because they just said what I had been saying for years, which is this guy doesn't accept responsibility for his behaviour, that I felt there were mental health issues, that he doesn't think what he's done, there's literally nothing wrong with it, and that I strongly believe he'll do it again. And what they say is, yes, doesn't take culpability, he's minimising the offending behaviour, and that even with, and they're looking at pretty robust licence conditions in place, he cannot be safely managed in the community. So quite rightly, they didn't grant parole. And yet, as you say, because of the sentence structure, as things stand, he'll be released in February anyway. And what will have changed in 2 months? Absolutely nothing. So it's completely mind-blowing for me that even with all this information to hand, that the government will essentially release someone who they have said cannot be safely managed and who is, quite frankly, expected to reoffend. And it feels like some horrific sort of experiment where, quite frankly, victims' lives don't matter. There was a quote from a minister recently about it who said, when he's out, the sword of Damocles will be hanging over him. And my gut reaction to that was brilliant. So when he's damaged someone else, if they're lucky enough to survive, then you'll do something about it. It's just too late. They really need to be preventative.
One thing that I find really baffling is that it escalated to the point where it sounds like a complete horror movie. You're coming out your car at night. You mentioned you live in a rural area. There's no one around you, and quite frankly, that sounds like a stalker's paradise in a lot of ways. You step out your car, and he's there holding a shotgun. And this is publicly known to people because you're an activist. You go out, you talk about it. There's pictures, horrifying pictures of this incident that I'm not recommending people Google, but it is there, where you're coming out into the darkness and he is there with a shotgun pointed at you. And he's been in prison, and they're now saying he is still a danger to you, to the public, because of his beliefs, which I read in one of the articles that you've done about his beliefs that you're to blame, or that women are to blame. Or
I think it's not so much. I think saying his beliefs suggests it's something which you could educate around. Okay, if it's someone's beliefs, then potentially you can educate about belief. But I strongly believe, and it's touched on slightly in the parole board letter, that actually for him it's hard wiring. This is how he behaves. He absolutely doesn't think he's done anything wrong. And if you don't think you've done anything wrong, if you're not culpable for what you've done, you're likely to only do it, you're likely to go and do it again. And I'm very aware of the work of Jane Monckton Smith and the 8 steps from domestic abuse to homicide. And he absolutely fits this mold. And what blows my mind is when all this information, in some ways, I feel like I've worked quite hard to make it as clear as I can at all stages of the criminal justice system that this man is a risk and a danger. And yet it trundles on. It trundles on. And what will they say to the next victim? At what point will they consider a victim's life, a victim's right to live, it should be prioritised over, quite frankly, outdated and uneducated parts of law that mean that these people get to go on and reoffend? And when we're told, he'll have strict licence conditions, well, if we weren't aware of, and you see them in the press, men on licence who then go on to murder, it's not working, it's broken. And part of the problem, you touched about the CCTV footage, which I do, I have shared with media and I use when I'm delivering training, because I've been told actually seeing it makes it real, seeing it's really impactful. And that's, in some ways, it's a good thing, because it means that for, I hope, the majority of people, they haven't experienced what I have. What I have to be careful about, and this will count for a huge number of victims of stalking, is how I normalise things, because you get used to it. Because you get used to it, so you minimise it a bit, and maybe you doubt yourself, and that's compounded massively by how the criminal justice system deals with it. So when I was reporting stalking all the way through, and being told he's not doing anything, and at the time I didn't know enough to know he was absolutely doing masses and should have been apprehended, and everything that followed could have been prevented. I had the police, who at that stage I trusted, because you do, don't you? We're brought up thinking that, telling me, no, he's not doing anything wrong. He's not going anywhere he can't go. We can't do anything about it. And all the way through, apart from the brief period when he was arrested 3 times in the May 2019, he had his guns and the threat of that. And you touched on the rurality. It's an aspect I do speak about, because he absolutely maximised rurality. And I'll say to people, I think there's no skill in being a stalker here, if I want to be rude about it. You could be 3 feet in front of me and I wouldn't know. You can actually watch our access track from miles away. It's the only way in and out to here, and you'll know who's at home, what have you. So don't give him any kudos as far as being particularly skilled at this. It's not difficult. He absolutely maximised it, and any of the, to date, measures put in place, the way it's been talked about, the rurality, the isolation, the lack of phone signal, the lack of witnesses, the distances, none of it has been taken into account. One size does not fit all. And it's really important that the population understand this and appreciate it, and they understand the impact of stalking, and what stalking is in its many, many guises, but also that the criminal justice system learn and change and, quite frankly, stop people being murdered.
Yeah, you touched on that there, which was something I was going to ask you, is what can the justice system and individuals learn from your experience to ensure that this doesn't happen to others? And I know that's quite a difficult question to answer.
I think that, well, the first thing is, when the justice system wants to learn, that's actually really encouraging, that the justice system recognises it isn't functioning efficiently and it's leaving lives at risk. And, I've talked about it with you briefly before, and I realise it may not be a popular thing to always say, but I realised relatively early on that, quite frankly, the lives that are lost don't matter. Okay, the lives lost don't matter to the justice system. They do matter. They don't matter to the justice system. If they matter to the justice system, more would be done much, much faster. The number of people whose lives are destroyed, whether they're murdered by the perpetrator, whether they have to imprison themselves in order to hope to be safe, whether they're driven to committing suicide because of the pressure and the intensity of the offending. If those lives mattered, the justice system would do a lot more. So I'm very open to working with the justice system and the wanting to improve. What can they do? Well, I think that one of the massive things is to understand that stalking is a separate offence to domestic abuse, and it should be treated as such. And that actually, when stalkers are managed, if that's the right word to use, in the same way as domestic abusers, it can make them much worse. It can intensify the behaviour, make them ramp up that extra step. The victims need to be, without that understanding of how stalkers operate, you cannot protect the victims. And as far as sentencing, it's been commented on by a couple of quite senior people within the system in the last couple of months to me that what my perpetrator was sentenced to is really on the very, very low side. And I have the reasons I think specifically that has come about. But I think where sentencing should be is it should recognise the impact of stalking on the victim. And it doesn't do that. And I think a lot of that is to do with the lack of understanding by not just the criminal justice system, but the general public about stalking, about what it might be, about how it affects people, and about where it leads. There's small measures in place at the moment, but it's just laughable, quite frankly. The police have got stalking protection orders. Brilliant. What do they actually do? How many actually implemented? How many know what to do? They're utterly worthless. It's just fluff designed to keep people quiet a bit, keep the victims quiet. It doesn't, unless there are measures in place which where the stalkers can be properly monitored, and if they break the boundaries, there are significant consequences. All of this is meaningless, absolutely meaningless. So I'd say the first thing is to really recognise the risk that stalkers present. And if we want to go along with the horrific reality that the lives don't matter, if the money spent on this matters to the criminal justice system, then the criminal justice system could save itself and society huge chunks of money if they address the problem instead of having to pick up the pieces afterwards.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point today, is like you say about money. The money that is spent on this is extraordinary when you look at it. And I'll put a link in the show notes to a report that is about sort of domestic abuse and the money that goes into this side of things.
We've got the victims bill is in Parliament again at the moment. And for me, I'm really pleased they're looking at the victims bill, but actually, until it gives victims, as an absolute bottom line, the same support as perpetrators, and until it's sustainably funded, it's worthless. It's not going to be effective. We touched on figures, and it was in the press in about a month ago, I think. Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, saying £12 million going towards, I think it was workplace education around domestic abuse. And brilliant, great, sounds like a huge amount of money, unless you look at what the cost of domestic abuse is. And that, you and I know a domestic abuse murder, which is what stalking would probably still be classed under, domestic abuse homicides, roughly £1 million as far as cost. I saw figures earlier this week where the annual cost of domestic abuse to the UK economy is 70-something odd billion. 12 million is looking like nothing. Absolutely looking like nothing. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable that the lives don't matter. That's been a really unpleasant lesson to learn. But the money, the money's being thrown away as well. It's unbelievable that more money isn't being invested into prevention when that would be a much, much cheaper option on all fronts.
I think that's a really important point to be made, especially in prevention. So I suppose my final question, Rhianon, is why did you want to take part in this podcast? I know you've been all over the place. You've been on Good Morning Britain. You've been featured in the Daily Mail. So I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me on this podcast. But what is your key message for listeners? Why did you want to come on the podcast today?
Well, first of all, because I so appreciate what you do. And when we first spoke, for me, it was like, wow, this is brilliant. Here's a young woman who recognises the issue, that people don't understand stalking, the impact that how it's portrayed in media, and that being how a general population may learn. And there's so much change to be made. And it's just, I would hope that by speaking out, if it helps educate enough to prevent what happened to me and what's still happening to me, goodness knows what will happen when he's out. I know what's expected, happening to anybody else. And so it's really, I think that through sharing my experience, it will improve the situation for others, but also really wanting to support what you're doing, because I'm in huge admiration of the steps that you're taking, and what you're doing will have such a significant impact for so many people that you may well not be aware of, but really will. Incredible. So thank you very much for doing what you're doing.
No, I mean, thank you. This could just be a love fest at this point where we're talking about how good each other is, but I really appreciate that, and thank you for saying that. But really, I only do
wanting to make a difference and proactively doing something about it.
Yeah, really, I only do what I'm doing because people like yourself are brave enough to actually step out and talk about these things, because it isn't spoken about enough. And the fact that I'll go on to Daily Mail and I'll see you there talking about this. And this can't be easy. We spoke about that. Sometimes it's that you're carrying a torch somewhat for victims that have experienced this that can speak out about it. But you're taking that and you're running with it because you know that if you don't, who will?
One of the reasons for speaking with the press, and I do try my best to work with journalists, and they're really, really patient, because my PTSD means that I can, as you might know, Karen, go off on 100 miles an hour and have to be told when to stop talking. But I want them to understand what it's like. I don't want them to portray it in any way that isn't real. So it's really important for me to work with them. And because you and I know there are victims throughout society who will access all sorts of different media. So actually all the outlets are valid. Just hoping that by sharing what I experience helps others learn and makes change for the better.
I think that's a really powerful statement to sort of finish this. Apart from saying thank you again, also to anyone that's listening to this, I'll leave some support links in the show notes. If you're experiencing this type of abuse, or you know someone who is, then there's help available. So don't stay silent, seek help, whatever that may look like to you. But thank you, Rhianon, for taking part. And I'm sure, and I know that we'll be doing plenty of work together in the future. This won't be the end of us talking. So thank you.
No way. Thank you so much for having me. I've really appreciated it. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Research. You can follow my research journey on LinkedIn and X at Karen Fullerton C. Special thanks to all research participants for taking part in my thesis and entrusting me with their story. And thanks to the Scottish Graduate School of Social Science and the University of the West of Scotland.